Elias stepped off the shuttle and immediately regretted trusting his own instincts about what simple arrival procedures meant. The ramp beneath his boots shimmered like liquid metal, rippling with each step, as though the floor itself were judging him. He muttered something about preferring solid ground and somehow got tangled in his own bag strap, nearly sending a hovering luggage pod careening into a crystalline column. The pod beeped indignantly, as if to say, "Really? Again?" Elias straightened, flushed, and whispered, "It's fine, totally fine. Nobody saw that. Nobody saw me nearly start an interstellar incident." The pod beeped again, and Elias gave it a sharp look. Judgmental luggage, he thought. This is going to be a long posting. The complex stretched in all directions, crystalline towers slicing into a pale lavender sky, walkways twisting like ribbons, and occasional bursts of light that seemed to defy explanation. Elias had read the protocol manual twice, but it had been written in the diplomatic equivalent of hieroglyphs with footnotes in quantum math. He thought he understood the basics. Don't knock over anything levitating, bow when prompted, and for the love of any mildly sentient AI, don't accidentally insult the Queen. Unfortunately, nothing in the manual prepared him for the concierge drone that zipped past, flicking sparks in his face and muttering something that sounded like, "Tourist human detected. Proceed with caution." Thank you," Elias offered, unsure if this was polite or highly offensive. The drone zipped on, leaving a trail of blinking lights that spelled, in some alien logic, "Good luck, loser." Elias shook his head and moved toward the main hall, noticing that the other courtiers seemed to float above the ground, with an ease that made him wonder if gravity was strictly optional in this part of the galaxy. One courtesan passed, ears elegantly elongated and twitching in a manner Elias guessed was some combination of greeting and mild disapproval. Elias bowed reflexively, overcompensating so much that his neck popped. The courtesan's eyes twinkled. Elias decided that might have been the wrong reaction. He entered the reception chamber where the Queen herself awaited, her long ears arched high, catching the subtle hum of the building itself. She looked human in the basic structure of face and body, but the elegance of her ears, the coppery gleam of her skin, and the faint aura of authority she carried made Elias immediately aware of just how unqualified he felt. He forced a smile and a bow, the kind he'd practiced in a mirror 5,000 miles from any alien court. The Queen's gaze lingered for exactly 3 heartbeats longer than politeness required. Elias took mental note. The Queen was either amused or calculating the optimal moment to vaporize him. Both options seemed equally likely. "Welcome, human," the Queen said, her voice smooth but carrying that subtle undertone of amusement that humans would have called sardonic. "Your presence has been noted." Elias nodded. "Thank you, Your Excellence." He grimaced at the word. "Your Highness," he corrected himself quickly, hoping that any lapse in proper address would not be fatal. The Queen tilted her head slightly, ears twitching, and Elias silently vowed to never underestimate a head tilt. She dismissed him with a small gesture, and Elias stumbled backward, only managing to recover by grabbing onto a floating rail that clearly had been intended for decoration rather than support. Days passed and Elias learned the rhythm of life in the complex. He discovered that the floors occasionally shifted without warning. The air sometimes carried whispers of unknown chemical composition, and the courtiers communicated both verbally and telepathically. One minor faux pas involved him complimenting a decorative chandelier only to realize it was sentient, and promptly ignored him for 3 hours. He learned to laugh at these mishaps, because if he didn't, he would have spent every day in a quiet panic, and the complex seemed designed to magnify panic to the level of a full-blown interstellar incident. Humor became a survival tool. One afternoon, while struggling to balance on a gravity-altered hallway that occasionally looped sideways, Elias slipped and performed a human impression of a flying space squirrel. The nearby attendant's long ears twitched in what he hoped was amusement and not horror. A tray of glowing beverages wobbled, A small drone beeped, and Elias muttered, "I swear I'm supposed to be a professional." No one corrected him, which Elias decided was either a sign of mercy or that everyone was too polite to laugh outright. Late nights were the hardest. Alone in his quarters, which hovered in a corner of the complex like a tiny human island, Elias unpacked a gift from the Queen. A small, holographic desk assistant that refused to pronounce his name correctly and occasionally rearranged his documents for optimal interstellar efficiency. He laughed aloud, realizing that maybe alien humor wasn't so different from human humor after all. The desk assistant beeped and flashed, seemingly mocking him, and Elias said, "All right, fine, you win this round, sparkly paper monster." The assistant blinked, and for a moment Elias thought it winked. By the end of his first week, Elias had learned three things. 1. Alien protocol was a living, breathing puzzle designed to confuse humans. 2. Long ears could express everything from amusement to outright judgment in a single twitch. And 3. He could survive in this complex if he kept laughing, tripped gracefully, and accepted that his luggage might one day file a complaint against him for incompetence. As he floated in his quarters, staring out at the lavender sky and crystalline towers, he whispered to himself, "If diplomacy were easy, it wouldn't be this much fun." Somewhere in the complex, a sentient corridor hummed in agreement, or possibly amusement. Elias didn't care which. He was ready. Elias had begun to think of the royal complex as a living puzzle that occasionally yawned in his face, and today was no exception. He stepped into the main hall for the morning protocol briefing, which was less a meeting and more a demonstration of synchronized alien elegance. Courtiers glided across the floor like living marionettes, ears flicking in precise patterns, robes trailing behind them in ways that defied both gravity and human logic. Elias tried to copy their motions and ended up spinning in a half-circle that nearly launched him into a hovering sculpture of a sentient star cluster. The sculpture beeped indignantly, and Elias muttered, "Sorry, I'm still learning to be weightless and graceful at the same time." No one responded. They had already seen worse, he guessed, including his failed attempt at a synchronized bow the day before that had caused a minor ripple in a floating water fountain. He approached the lectern where his human-sized clipboard was no longer necessary, replaced instead by a small hovering AI orb that projected schedules, memos, and occasionally sarcastic suggestions. "Morning, Elias," it said in a voice he had begun to consider slightly smug. "Today's lesson, mastering the etiquette of multi-species small talk without accidentally insulting the gravity fields." Elias blinked, imagining a conversation in which gravity fields could be offended. "Right," he said. "I'll do my best." The first task involved navigating a round of greetings between the Queen's advisors. They hovered around him, ears twitching and robes swishing, their skin shimmering with faint bioluminescent patterns. One advisor leaned slightly, ears flicking in what he suspected was amusement or mild critique, and Elias responded with a bow so careful it felt like he had just defused an alien bomb. The advisor nodded approvingly, or at least neutrally, and Elias made a mental note to continue pretending he understood exactly what was happening. Later, during a break in the formalities, Elias discovered that the court had a sense of humor entirely its own. A pair of attendants played a game in the hall with levitating spheres that occasionally whispered insults at passing humans. One sphere floated toward him and said, "Earthling." Clumsy but sincere, and Elias laughed outright, startling a nearby holographic display that emitted a small shockwave of colored light. "Hey, I'll take that as a compliment," he said, and the sphere spun away, apparently satisfied. The attendants, long ears flicked in what Elias interpreted as approval. Humor, he realized, could act as a diplomatic lubricant here, though it required careful calibration to avoid accidentally offending anyone or anything. During the midday council, the Queen herself appeared, her long ears angled slightly backward, signaling attention. Elias positioned himself just far enough from the center to be visible but not intrusive, hoping to blend into the complex choreography of hovering robes, blinking lights, and softly vibrating floors. The council discussed interstellar trade routes, gravitational fluxes, and the emotional needs of certain semi-sentient planetary systems. Elias nodded frequently, smiled when appropriate, and once mistakenly laughed at a quantum taxation joke he didn't understand, only to have the speaker pause and give him a curious glance. He improvised, "Ah, yes, interplanetary fiscal humor, very subtle," and the speaker's ears twitched. Elias decided it was a pass. That afternoon, he was assigned to a protocol exercise, escorting a visiting ambassador from a neighboring system. The ambassador resembled a floating gelatinous cube, eyes scattered across its semi-transparent body, and emitted a faint hum whenever it was nervous, which was always. Elias attempted small talk, asking about its preferred method of hovering during high-speed space travel. The cube responded with a series of pulsating colors and a soft gurgle that Elias interpreted with 70% confidence as a friendly joke. The orb hovering by his side projected subtitles, likely amused, not alarmed. Elias grinned. "Score 1 for human diplomacy," he whispered, giving the cube a thumbs up, which it returned with a wobble of approval. The evening brought a rare moment of calm in the otherwise relentless dance of protocol. Elias wandered the gardens, a maze of suspended platforms, low-gravity fountains, and plants that hummed tunefully when touched. He was attempting to fold laundry, his human-sized clothes floating in a minor anti-gravity field, when a small commotion caught his attention. A tiny alien creature, no taller than his knee, zipped past, narrowly missing a levitating shrub. Elias lunged instinctively, catching it by the tail. The creature squeaked in a mixture of indignation and amusement, ears twitching wildly. "Easy, easy," Elias said. "I swear I'm not here to mess up your life." He placed it gently on a floating platform, only for it to leap away immediately and disappear in a swirl of glowing petals. As he settled back into his quarters, the orb hovered beside him, projecting the day's incidents in a holographic summary. "Observation," it said, blinking impatiently. "You handled approximately 94% of alien social dynamics correctly. The remaining 6% includes near collisions, misinterpreted quantum jokes, and accidental emotional offense to a sentient chandelier." Elias groaned. "I'll take it. That's basically a passing grade, right?" The orb blinked twice. "Interpret as you will. Survival remains the key metric." Elias chuckled. He began to understand that survival here was less about avoiding disasters and more about navigating absurdity with patience, wit, and occasional clumsiness that could be shrugged off as charm. By the time the twin moons rose outside his window, Elias felt a strange satisfaction. He had spent the day balancing the precarious line between protocol and chaos, humor and decorum, human logic and alien absurdity. Somewhere in the distance, a corridor hummed in what he swore was amusement, and a pair of sentient flowers nodded politely in his direction. Elias sank onto a hovering chair, letting the slight anti-gravity lift carry him lazily upward, and whispered, "If this is diplomacy, maybe I'm starting to enjoy it." The orb floated above him, blinking. Cautious optimism noted. "Humor is a survival advantage." Elias laughed aloud because apparently even the most rigid alien systems recognized the value of a well-timed joke. The morning of the assembly arrived with a subtle sense of mischief, though Elias didn't notice it at first. The halls hummed with low-energy currents, and the attendants twirled and glided with perfect symmetry, ears flicking in patterns that seemed simultaneously ceremonial and amused. Elias adjusted his tie, which hovered midair thanks to the anti-gravity lining the complex, and muttered, "All right, human, today you don't trip over anything, and no one gets offended. Simple." The tie floated lazily back into place, as if mocking him. He entered the main hall just as the court was gathering. Floating platforms shifted smoothly to make room for the dignitaries, and holographic displays projected diplomatic charts, star maps, and the occasional sarcastic quip from the AI concierges about past missteps in interstellar etiquette. Elias tried to memorize the seating arrangement, but after noticing one ambassador doing a slow pirouette while bowing to a sentient crystal, he realized it was impossible. He settled for standing in a corner, attempting to look purposeful, while silently praying he wouldn't be called upon to perform anything more complicated than breathing. As the assembly began, Elias practiced his polite nods, careful ear flicks, what humans would call shoulder shrugs, and subtle smiles calibrated to demonstrate respect without overenthusiasm. He noticed a small flurry of activity near the back of the hall, a quick shadow moving too fast to be any dignitary. One of the attendants' ears twitched sharply, a signal Elias had learned meant something unusual is about to happen, though the exact meaning remained delightfully vague. And then the boy appeared. He was tiny, barely reaching Elia's knee, with a confident bounce that defied both gravity and human expectations. Couldn't tell which. Elias cleared his throat. Thank you." He tried to keep his voice steady, though it wavered slightly with disbelief. The boy's grip tightened, as if to reassure him that the words were not to be taken lightly. The attendants finally reacted, ears twitching, murmurs flickering through the hall. One elder leaned forward and whispered something that caused his robes to glow faintly in indignation. Another floated slightly backward, perhaps in shock or to give Elias space. The difference was subtle, but Elias appreciated it all the same. The boy, seemingly oblivious to protocol, began tugging Elias toward the center of the hall. "Come with me," he said plainly. "Mother wants you to see this." Elias allowed himself to be guided, feeling the absurdity of the situation settle into something almost comfortable. He was a human, navigating alien formality, being led by a child who apparently had full clearance from the queen herself. Humor bubbled in him despite the gravity of the setting. "Well, this is officially the weirdest tour I've ever received," he thought, glancing down at the boy's determined face. The boy's commentary was relentless. He pointed at floating insignias and whispered conspiratorial explanations about which ones were secretly prank devices, warned Elias about a hovering floor panel that occasionally tried to trip newcomers, and offered unsolicited advice about bowing etiquette that seemed contradictory to everything Elias had learned. Elias laughed quietly, realizing that humor could survive even in the most rigid ceremonies if delivered by someone with zero regard for rank or decorum. As they moved through the hall, courtiers whispered among themselves, ears flicking, robes swaying, holographic displays pausing mid-animation. The queen watched from her elevated platform, long ears angled slightly back, observing without interference. Elias caught her glance for a fleeting moment, and the smallest, rarest smile brushed her features, subtle enough that a casual observer might have missed it entirely. When they reached the central dais, the boy released Elias' hand and looked up at him with unwavering certainty. "See, I told you," he said, as though this confirmed something long suspected. Elias nodded, trying to compose himself, aware that the assembly had watched an entire human's composure hinge on the words of a child. Elias realized something profound yet simple. This was recognition, pure and unadorned. Titles, protocol, centuries of hierarchy, all of it fell away in the presence of truth spoken plainly. And yet, the humor of it, the child taking charge, the absurdity of his tiny hand commanding attention in a hall of centuries-old ritual, kept him grounded, reminding him that even the most formal settings could be human, playful, and deeply real. By the time they returned to the edge of the hall, the courtiers had resumed their motions. The holograms flickered back to life, and the floating trays of luminescent beverages hovered once more in their expected patterns. Elias adjusted his posture, smoothed his floating tie, and whispered to the boy, "You might just make a diplomat out of me yet." The boy's ears twitched in what Elias assumed was a smirk. "Mother says I know who's important," he replied, tugging gently toward the garden exit, already planning their next adventure through the complexities of a court that now seemed both terrifying and wonderfully absurd. Elias awoke that morning with a mild sense of purpose and a lingering confusion about gravity-adjusted beds. His blanket floated in lazy spirals above him, obedient to the complex's anti-gravity systems, and he had to swat it gently back onto his body without waking the room's hovering lighting or accidentally initiating a minor electrostatic storm. "Good morning, universe," he muttered. "Let's not startle anyone today." The desk orb blinked in what could have been amusement or judgment and projected a reminder. Protocol exercises, morning briefing, 0 interstellar incidents, humor allowance 20%. Elias grinned. 20% humor seemed generous, yet somehow entirely manageable. By the time he reached the gardens, the small alien boy was already waiting. He perched on the edge of a floating platform like a miniature commander, ears twitching in what Elias suspected was a calculated display of authority. "Morning," the boy chirped, tugging lightly at Elias' sleeve. "Mother says you need more practice walking on unstable floors without flailing." Elias groaned. "I think I've mastered the art of flailing with dignity," he said. The boy twitched his ears, a gesture Elias decided was a polite smirk, and dashed off toward a cluster of hovering blossoms that hummed when disturbed. Elias followed, feeling both absurd and privileged, a human being guided through alien life by the most candid, tiny diplomat in the known galaxy. The morning briefing unfolded with all the usual ceremony, but now Elias carried an invisible shield of the boy's endorsement. The council debated the ethics of trading quantum energy fields for emotive star clusters, and Elias nodded at the correct intervals, smiled at precisely the right moments, and even managed a well-timed chuckle when a holographic diplomat floated upside down while delivering a point. His timing was imperfect, but the boy whispered corrections from his pocket-sized hiding place near the dais. "Smile more, nod less, float like you mean it." Elias laughed quietly, realizing that humor and absurdity were as much tools of survival here as etiquette itself. After the council, Elias found himself wandering through the anti-gravity arboretum, where plants hummed in patterns that suggested faint amusement. The boy led him to a fountain of liquid light, hovering in midair, pulsing in soft rhythms. "Mother says this one sings better if you twirl," he said. Elias raised an eyebrow. "Twirl." The boy nodded vigorously. "Yes, twirl, hum, pretend you're diplomatic, very important." Elias took a deep breath and spun, arms flailing slightly, laughing as the fountain pulsed in brighter colors, responding to his ridiculous imitation of interstellar diplomacy. Nearby, a pair of floating attendants, ears twitched in what Elias interpreted as bemusement. Later, he attempted to assist a visiting envoy, a crystalline being whose body refracted light into shifting rainbows. Elias approached carefully, offering a verbal greeting and a practiced bow, only for the envoy to respond with a flurry of mirrored gestures and melodic chimes. Elias froze. The boy leaned on his shoulder, whispering, "Just nod like you understand even if you don't. That's what Mother says." Elias nodded vigorously, realizing that for the first time, childlike honesty, paired with a generous allowance for humor, could navigate even the most bewildering interstellar exchanges. In the afternoon, the Queen appeared briefly in the gardens, ears tilted back slightly as she observed Elias interacting with her son. He felt a flicker of unease. He was still human, still an outsider, still prone to the occasional spectacular blunder. But the boy tugged at his hand and whispered, "Mother says you're doing fine. Don't worry about her staring, she likes it." Elias laughed quietly, realizing that endorsement from the smallest court member carried weight far beyond any formal commendation. The day's exercises continued, and Elias grew increasingly adept at reading subtle signals. The flick of an ear, the pulse of a holographic display, the slight quiver in a levitating tea set. Each misstep could have been catastrophic, yet humor allowed him to survive unscathed. At one point, a hovering tea tray wobbled precariously, and Elias quipped, "Gravity is obviously in a mood today." The tray righted itself, either amused or convinced he was harmless, and he bowed to it solemnly. The boy laughed, ears twitching, and Elias realized that small moments of levity could reshape the tension of an entire assembly. By evening, Elias found himself seated beside the boy in a quiet courtyard, floating lanterns casting soft colors over low-gravity fountains. "Mother says important people need breaks," the boy announced with the authority only a 5-year-old, or an alien prince, could summon. Elias leaned back in his anti-gravity chair, letting himself float lazily as he exhaled. "I think I'll take that advice," he said. The boy twitched his ears, clearly satisfied, and began recounting a story about an interstellar space race where sentient planets kept switching lanes. Elias laughed until he nearly floated into a fountain. As the moons rose, Elias understood the profound simplicity of the child's words. Recognition could exist without ceremony, validation could arrive without pomp, and humor could bridge worlds even in the most formal of contexts. He had survived a day of rigid alien protocol not because he had mastered every nuance, but because he had learned to embrace absurdity, to follow honest guidance, and to let himself laugh in the face of complexity. The boy's tiny hand rested on his shoulder, a steadying presence in a universe that spun in patterns both beautiful and incomprehensible. "Mother says you're like family now," the boy added casually, as if testing the limits of diplomacy itself. Elias smiled, floating gently above the courtyard floor. "I'll try not to mess that up," he said. The boy's ears twitched in amusement, and Elias knew that in a court defined by ceremony, politics, and unspoken hierarchies, the simplest truth could carry the greatest weight. A child's honesty, paired with a well-placed joke, could make even the most human of humans feel extraordinary. Elias woke to the soft hum of the complex, the floors gently adjusting his quarters to the morning light. His blanket floated lazily above him, untucked in perfect anti-gravity rebellion, and he swatted it down with a tired, amused sigh. The small alien boy was already waiting, perched on the edge of a hovering platform, ears twitching impatiently. "Morning," the boy said, tugging at Elias' sleeve. "Mother says today is important." Elias blinked at the tiny proclamation. "Everything's important when you're 5 and royal." The boy twitched his ears and nodded solemnly, which in this context meant that Elias had no choice but to comply. The day began with the usual exercises in diplomacy, floating corridors, and courteous chaos. Elias guided visiting envoys, one a gelatinous sphere with a penchant for dramatic color shifts, another a crystalline being that hummed melodically when excited, through the gardens and halls, all while receiving real-time commentary from the boy. "Smile, nod, laugh at the right time but not too much. Gravity is optional. Most importantly, don't trip on history." Elias obeyed, laughing quietly to himself when he nearly slipped on a shifting platform. The boy's ears twitched in what could only be amusement, and Elias realized that, after weeks in the complex, he had learned to thrive not by perfect compliance but by improvisation paired with humor. Midday brought a council session, and Elias took his usual place near the floating dais, feeling lighter than he ever had in a formal setting. He had memorized enough gestures, pauses, and nods to survive without constantly panicking, but more importantly, he had learned to let the absurdity of the court buoy him instead of crushing him. A misbehaving holographic delegate drifted upside down mid-speech. Elias winked at it and mouthed an exaggerated apology. The boy giggled, bouncing slightly in low gravity, and Elias realized that he no longer feared embarrassment. He embraced it as a tool of connection. After the council, the queen emerged, her long ears arched slightly back, and Elias felt the familiar mixture of awe and nerves. Yet when she smiled, faint but unmistakable, he understood he had earned her quiet acknowledgement, not through titles, reports, or ceremonies, but through constancy, humor, and the trust of her son. The boy tugged at Elia's hand and whispered, "Mother says you're doing well. More than well, actually. You're important." Elias laughed softly, a real laugh that lifted him higher than any anti-gravity lift ever could. "I think I can handle that," he said, and for the first time he felt that he truly belonged here. Not as a human outsider, not as a token liaison, but as a recognized part of the court's rhythm. The afternoon passed in a series of small victories, guiding a group of junior courtiers through a levitating maze, correcting the orbit of a sentient tea set that had gone rogue, and helping a quantum fountain find its proper tune after a minor hiccup in its musical field. Each task carried the same mix of tension and absurdity, yet Elias met them with a lightness he had never known before. Humor had become armor, patience a weapon, and the boys trust the compass that guided him. He tripped, fell, and recovered gracefully enough that even a hovering tray of luminescent beverages seemed impressed. Evening arrived, and the boy led Elias to a quiet observation deck overlooking the floating gardens and the crystalline towers reflecting twin moons. "Mother says this is the right place for important people," the boy declared, folding his small hands neatly. Elias leaned against the edge of the platform, feeling the gentle tug of low gravity beneath him. "You make it hard to mess up," he said, smiling. The boy's ears twitched in response, and Elias realized he no longer needed the Queen's silent approval to feel validated. The boy's simple, unfiltered acknowledgement had reshaped the way he measured his own worth. They watched as the complex's lights pulsed softly, signaling the end of the day. Elias thought about the weeks he had spent stumbling through formalities, learning the rhythm of a court entirely alien yet strangely familiar, and discovering the odd poetry of interstellar humor. He had begun as a human uncertain of his place, awkwardly bowing and flailing through ceremonial mishaps. Now he moved with quiet confidence, guided by laughter, honesty, and the bond of trust forged in the smallest of gestures. A hand held without hesitation, a child's simple words. The boy turned to him, small and resolute, ears twitching like twin beacons. "Mother says you're ready," he said. Elias laughed softly. "Ready for what?" The boy shrugged. "To be important, to belong. To not trip over the galaxy's absurdities anymore." Elias floated beside him, smiling at the impossibility and perfection of the moment. "I'll try not to ruin it," he said. "No promises," the boy replied, grinning. Elias chuckled, realizing that sometimes being important wasn't about ceremonies or accolades. It was about trust, laughter, and the courage to step forward when no one else expected you to. As the moons rose higher, the Queen's distant silhouette visible on a far balcony, Elias understood that the